They thought they were locking a senile old man in a nursing home to wait for his inheritance, but they didn't realize they had just handed the keys of their organized scheme to a retired colonel who still knew how to hunt. They planned to bury me, but they forgot that an old wolf is at his most dangerous when he's cornered. The day they walked me through the sterile, antiseptic halls of Oak Haven Senior Living, I didn't fight them. I let my daughter Elena smooth my collar with hands that smelled of expensive perfume and hollow excuses, and I watched my son Marcus avoid my eyes as he handed a stack of legal documents to the receptionist. I was 78 years old, a retired colonel with 2 Purple Hearts, a spine of steel, and a mind that had been sharpened by 40 years of intelligence operations. They thought they were tucking away a senile old man. They didn't realize they were imprisoning a man who had spent his life reading the tactical weaknesses of people far more dangerous than 2 spoiled, greedy adults. They told me it was for my own good. "You've been forgetting things, Dad," Marcus had said, his voice dripping with practiced fake concern. "The house is too big, the bills are piling up, and we just want you safe." I had nodded then, a soft, pathetic smile plastered on my face. I played the part of the frail veteran perfectly. I didn't tell them that the forgotten bills were actually offshore accounts I'd been quietly liquidating, or that the confusion was actually a tactical withdrawal from a home they had been trying to claim for years. When the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the air shifted. It wasn't the smell of a nursing home, it was the smell of a cage. My room was small, white, and smelled of industrial bleach. They had taken my phone, my vintage watch, and my laptop, claiming I needed minimal distractions. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across my bed, I heard the faint, muffled sound of voices from the nursing station down the hall. I didn't need hearing aids. I had spent years in listening posts where you could identify the caliber of a weapon by the echo of a shot 3 miles away. I pressed my ear to the door. "The old man is locked in," the head nurse was saying. Her voice was too sharp, too rhythmic. "His kids signed the power of attorney. We have full access to his assets starting tomorrow morning." "Are you sure he won't figure it out?" a man's voice replied. It was deeper, colder. "He's a retired colonel. Even if he's old, these types have connections." "He's nothing but a senile ghost," the nurse scoffed, "and his kids are so desperate for the inheritance money that they've already cleared the paperwork for the transfer. They think we're a luxury retirement home. They have no idea what's actually happening in the basement." My heart didn't race. It steadied. My breath slowed. I had been retired for a decade, but the muscle memory of a field operation didn't rust. I walked over to the closet, the only place in the room where the cameras couldn't see the baseboard, and knelt. I pressed a hidden release on the wooden paneling, a trick I'd installed the first night I'd moved into my own house, just in case I ever needed a safe room. The panel clicked. Inside, hidden behind the drywall, was a burner phone and a small, high-frequency signal jammer I had kept as a souvenir from a mission in 1998. I realized then that this wasn't just a greedy attempt by my children to steal my estate. They had unwittingly handed me over to a dangerous organization. This facility was a front for a massive operation, a place where people were liquidated to cover up financial crimes. My children weren't just putting me in a home. They were selling me out to a group that was currently trafficking illegal goods through the city. I checked the burner phone. It was encrypted, and it had a single message waiting. "The package is inside, awaiting disposal." They weren't just waiting for my money. They were waiting for me to be erased. I stood up, feeling the familiar, cold fire of a combat scenario ignite in my blood. I looked at the security camera in the corner, knowing they were watching, and I gave it a small, slow smile. I didn't know who was on the other end of that message, but I knew one thing for certain. They had made the fatal mistake of underestimating an old wolf who still remembered how to hunt. Just as I reached for the handle to unlock the door, the lights in the entire wing suddenly flickered and died. the hallway plunged into total darkness, and the heavy electronic lock on my door let out a sharp, metallic clack. It was unlocked. Someone was coming for me, and they weren't going to be holding flowers. The silence that followed the click of the lock was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that only exists before a kinetic engagement. I didn't reach for the light switch. I pressed my back against the wall adjacent to the doorframe, slipping into the shadow cast by the wardrobe. I was 78, yes, but my joints had the fluid grace of a man who had navigated urban ruins in total darkness. I held my breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. A floorboard creaked in the corridor, a deliberate, heavy tread. Whoever was coming didn't fear discovery. They were arrogant, and arrogance is the deadliest vulnerability in any operative. Through the sliver of space between my door and the frame, I caught a glimpse of a beam of light cutting through the dark. It was a tactical flashlight, mounted on something small and silenced. The door pushed open, the hinges screaming a protest I had greased yesterday when I first suspected this facility's true nature. The silhouette that entered was tall, framed by the dim exit sign at the end of the hall. He didn't hesitate, stepping directly into the center of my room, his light sweeping the bed where I had left a pile of pillows shaped like a sleeping man. I didn't wait for him to realize the bed was empty. I lunged. I didn't strike with the frantic energy of a confused senior. I struck with the precise economy of motion efficiency taught to me in the deepest, darkest programs of the military. I caught his wrist, the one holding the weapon, and redirected the force of his own momentum into the doorframe. There was a sickening thud, the sound of bone meeting hard wood. The weapon clattered to the floor, but he was fast. He twisted, throwing a punch that would have shattered a younger man's jaw. I ducked, feeling the wind of his fist pass over my ear, and delivered a swift, brutal strike to his solar plexus. He gasped, dropping to his knees, clutching his stomach. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I kicked the fallen weapon under the bed, a piece of illegal equipment that clearly had no place in a nursing home, and pinned him against the wall with a forearm against his throat. "Who sent you?" I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel grinding against stone. "Is it my children? Did they sell me to this organized scheme for a payout?" The man struggled, his face turning a shade of purple, but his eyes weren't filled with fear. They were filled with a cold, hollow obedience. "You're already dead, Colonel," he wheezed, a pathetic, distorted smile touching his lips. "The organization doesn't care about your kids. They just needed the property to store the packages. You were just a minor inconvenience, an audit risk." My grip tightened. "What packages?" "Look, under the floorboards," he managed to choke out before his head lolled back. "The basement. It's not for the seniors." Suddenly, the intercom system, which had been silent for hours, erupted with a screech of feedback. A voice, smooth and synthesized, echoed through the entire floor. "Security check. Subject in room 204. Report your status immediately. If you fail to respond, the cleaning protocols will initiate ahead of schedule." The man beneath me started to laugh, a wet, rattling sound. I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins that he wasn't just a guard, he was a beacon. As long as he was alive and not reporting in, they would assume a breach. And if there was a breach, they wouldn't send another man. They would wipe the wing entirely. I had to move. I dragged him toward the bathroom, but as I reached for the door handle, I heard the sound of heavy boots echoing from the far end of the hall. Not one, but 4 sets of rhythmic, military-style footsteps. They weren't coming to investigate. They were a tactical team coming to sanitize the room. I looked down at the man, then at the vent cover in the bathroom floor. It was my only exit, but it was narrow, and I was far from light. I pulled a small, jagged piece of metal from my pocket, a tool I'd fashioned from a bed frame leg, and forced the vent open. The smell of damp earth and something metallic wafted up. It wasn't just a basement, It was an industrial warehouse level hidden beneath the facility. As the first boot stepped into my doorway, I realized the man on the floor was holding a detonator. His thumb was already depressing the trigger, a crazed look of martyrdom in his eyes. "We all go home, Colonel," he hissed. The lights flared back on, blindingly bright, and I saw the red LED on the device blink from green to a pulsing, rapid crimson. 3 seconds. I threw myself into the dark abyss of the vent just as the door to my room was kicked wide open, and the world behind me turned into a wall of white-hot, deafening fire. The blast wave hit me like a physical hammer, slamming my body against the rusted iron grating of the ventilation shaft. My ears rang with the high-pitched whine of sudden deafness, and the taste of cordite and pulverized concrete coated my tongue. I didn't black out. I couldn't afford to. My lungs burned as I crawled through the suffocatingly tight space, dragging my legs behind me. The fire from the room behind me was licking at the edges of the vent, hungry and bright, but the cool, stagnant air of the crawl space pushed back against the heat. I wasn't just crawling, I was navigating the guts of a beast. This wasn't a standard nursing home layout. I'd spent enough time in underground command bunkers to recognize the structural anomalies here. The vibrations through the metal ducting told me that heavy machinery was operating directly beneath me. I pulled myself forward, my knuckles bleeding where the rivets had scraped them raw, until I reached a junction where the duct widened into a service chase. Through a narrow gap in the iron slats, I looked down. My breath hitched. Below me, the floor of the basement had been hollowed out into a high-security storage hub. It was an organized scheme of massive proportions. Beneath the guise of a quiet facility, there were rows of industrial-sized lockers, their doors reinforced with steel plates. Men in gray tactical gear moved between them, logging crates into a digital manifest. But it wasn't the crates that made my skin crawl. It was the stacks of packages with the heavy, chemical-resistant seal. Forbidden substances. This was a transshipment point for an illicit trade network, and my children, those pathetic, money-hungry vultures, had effectively signed me into the center of a cartel's supply chain. They hadn't just put me away, they had turned me into a permanent resident of a crime scene. I watched as a familiar face walked into the light of the warehouse floor. It was Marcus. He was shaking hands with a man whose suit cost more than my entire military pension. Marcus looked nervous, glancing around at the heavy, illegal equipment slung over the guard's shoulders. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a pawn who had bitten off more than he could chew. "The old man was an issue," the man in the suit said, his voice echoing up through the vent. "Your sister assured us he was senile, but my lead scout just checked in. Or rather, he didn't." Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead. "We just wanted the house, the accounts. We didn't know you were using the basement for that." "Ignorance is a luxury you can no longer afford," the man replied. He signaled to one of the guards, who stepped forward and clicked a remote. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. It showed the smoking, scorched ruins of my room on the floor above. "If he died in the blast, we have a problem with the fire department," the man continued coldly. "If he escaped, we have a problem with a trained operative who knows exactly where we are. Either way, your family is now deeply invested in our success. If he's still breathing, you're the one who's going to hunt him down, Marcus. After all, he's your father." I gripped my improvised weapon, the cold steel biting into my palm. The rage that surged through me wasn't the blind fury of a victim. It was the calculated, icy determination of a soldier whose mission had just become personal. I moved to the next ventilation grate, testing the screws. It was loose. I could drop down into the supply closet adjacent to the main loading dock. Just as I prepared to kick the grate out, the ductwork shuddered. A shadow blocked the light from the warehouse floor. A drone, small, sleek, and equipped with a thermal sensor, was hovering directly outside my hiding spot. Its red eye pulsed, locking onto my heat signature through the thin metal of the vent. A voice boomed from the facility's speakers, amplified and distorted. "Colonel, we know you're in the walls. You can stay in the dark, or you can step out and see your son one last time. Choose carefully, because the ventilation system is about to be flooded with a neuroparalytic agent." I looked at my watch. 3 minutes until the air would become toxic. I looked down at the room below. Marcus was standing right beneath me, looking up at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes. I realized then that they weren't just going to kill me, they were going to make my son watch, forcing him into a complicity he couldn't escape. I checked my burner phone one last time. 1 bar of service. I hit the emergency broadcast signal I had pre-programmed a decade ago, a signal meant for the internal security checks of the government agencies I once advised. It wouldn't bring in a tactical squad, but it would flag every illegal transaction in this building to the authorities within minutes. The vent began to hiss. The gas was being pumped in. I had 1 shot to take out the security lead, reach Marcus, and force a confession before the entire place went into lockdown. I braced my feet against the sides of the duct and launched myself downward, crashing through the ceiling tiles just as the room turned into a kaleidoscope of gunfire and blinding strobe lights. I hit the concrete floor like a falling weight, the momentum carrying me into a roll that ended at the feet of a startled guard. Before he could raise his weapon, I swept his legs, using the hard edge of my heel to shatter his knee. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Strobe lights pulsated, turning the room into a flickery nightmare of frozen motion and shadows. Bullets whizzed past my head, biting into the steel lockers and showering the floor with sparks. I didn't seek cover, I moved. I knew the geometry of these types of facilities, and I knew that in a tactical sweep, the center of the room was the only place they wouldn't fire indiscriminately for fear of damaging their own inventory. I lunged toward a forklift, diving behind a crate of illicit equipment to catch my breath. My heart was a steady, rhythmic thrumming in my chest, unaffected by the adrenaline that would have paralyzed a lesser man. Marcus was frozen against a concrete pillar, his face pale as death. He wasn't even looking at the guards. He was staring at me with a mix of horror and dawning realization. "Dad?" he screamed over the roar of the ventilation fans, which were now pumping high-pressure air to clear the paralytic agent. "They told me you were gone! They said it was just a financial settlement!" "Shut up, Marcus," I barked, grabbing a fallen piece of gear, a high-intensity tactical flashlight, and clicking it into strobe mode. I aimed it toward the far end of the room where the guards were regrouping. The blinding, flickering light disoriented them, forcing them to shield their eyes. I scanned the room for the man in the suit. He had vanished, retreating into the labyrinth of shipping crates toward the exit. He was the key. He was the one who held the proof of the organized scheme, the digital manifest that would implicate everyone from the nursing home management to the syndicate leadership. I lunged for Marcus, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him toward the service elevator. "Get in," I ordered. "I can't," he sobbed, his bravado shattered completely. "They have my wife, Dad. They have everyone." I stopped, the cold reality settling in. It wasn't just my house they were after, it was my bloodline. The organization had used my children as leverage, turning them into unwitting conduits for their operations. I felt a surge of genuine grief, but I buried it beneath the discipline of a veteran. There was no room for mourning in the middle of a breach. "Move," I commanded, my voice devoid of mercy. "We're going to get them back, but you have to stop acting like a victim and start acting like my son." We slammed into the elevator just as the guard's fire reached the control panel. Sparks showered over us, and the elevator groaned, its heavy cables vibrating. The doors began to slide shut, but a heavy boot wedged them open. A guard lunged inside, his face twisted in a snarl. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for his eyes. I jammed my thumb into the sensitive tissue with the force of a piston. He howled, his grip on the door loosening just enough for me to kick him back into the corridor. As the elevator began its slow, grinding ascent, I looked at the digital display. It wasn't headed for the main floor. The man in the suit had rigged the lift to stop at the sublevel, the furnace room. The lights in the elevator flickered, and the emergency bell began to ring with a shrill, incessant tone. The lift shuddered to a halt between floors, trapped in the shaft. Through the small gap in the elevator doors, I saw a liquid pouring down the sides of the shaft. It smelled thick, oily, and highly volatile. Above us, a heavy metallic clang echoed down the shaft. Then, the sound of a match being struck. A single, small flame appeared at the top of the shaft, reflected in the oily liquid. "They're not trying to capture us anymore," I whispered, pulling Marcus into the corner and bracing myself for the impact. "They're trying to turn this into a closed-system incineration." The flame dropped. The air in the shaft instantly ignited, a pillar of blue fire roaring downward toward our small metal cage. As the heat began to warp the steel walls of the elevator, I looked at my son, then at the roof hatch. I had one explosive charge left on my belt, a small breaching tool I'd scavenged from the guard's gear. It wouldn't stop the fire, but it might blow the hatch wide enough to give us a second of freedom. I jammed the device into the ceiling, my hands steady even as the heat singed my eyebrows. "If this fails," I told Marcus, "you better be ready to run into the flames." The timer hit 1 second. I covered my ears and slammed the button. A deafening roar filled the shaft, and the ceiling of the elevator ripped open, but instead of freedom, we looked up to find ourselves staring into the barrel of a heavy weapon held by a man waiting on the rafters above. He wasn't a guard, he was an assassin, and he was already pulling the trigger. The bullet punched through the gap in the ceiling, missing my skull by a fraction of an inch and burying itself into the steel floor. The elevator jolted under the impact of the explosion, the cables groaning as they began to fray. I didn't think. I moved with the kinetic efficiency of a man who had fought in the shadow of death for 40 years. I shoved Marcus toward the rear of the lift, effectively using him as a shield while I vaulted onto the mangled roof of the elevator. The assassin, perched on the narrow concrete ledge of the shaft, prepared to cycle his weapon. He was good, but he was expecting an old man to be slow. He wasn't expecting me to jump directly into his kill zone. I threw the heavy tactical flashlight, still strobing in a blinding, rhythmic pulse, directly into his face. The sudden, staccato flashes broke his focus, the disorienting strobe triggering a primal, physiological stutter in his aim. I lunged, my hands finding his throat with the grip of a combat-hardened veteran. We tumbled from the ledge, falling through the darkness of the shaft, but I caught the ladder bolted to the wall. The assassin wasn't so lucky. He plummeted toward the rising wall of fire at the bottom, his scream swallowed by the roar of the inferno. "Marcus, climb!" I roared, my voice echoing up the shaft. My son, fueled by the terrifying necessity of the moment, scrambled up the rungs. I followed, my muscles screaming in protest, the heat from the shaft blistering my skin. We reached the maintenance hatch and burst into the facility's administrative wing, a cold, sterile office that stood in stark contrast to the hell we had just escaped. But we weren't alone. Standing by the desk, holding a heavy-duty encrypted server drive, was the man in the suit. He had a sidearm drawn, aimed squarely at my chest. He looked calm, almost disappointed. "You really should have stayed in your room, Colonel," he said, his voice smooth. "The fire would have been a quiet end. Now, this is going to be messy." "The service records are on that drive, aren't they?" I said, standing tall, ignoring the blood dripping from a cut on my forehead. "The illegal transactions, the names of the investors, the connection to the government officials who are shielding this organized scheme. You weren't just storing goods, you were building an extortion machine." He smiled. "And who are you going to give it to? The police? The local authorities are on our payroll. You're a ghost, and soon you'll be a news story about a tragic accident at a nursing home." I looked at Marcus. He was shaking, but his eyes had hardened. He caught my look, the subtle nod I gave him. He didn't need to be a soldier to understand the maneuver. He lunged for the fire alarm on the wall, not to summon the police, but to trigger the building's internal suppression system. "Don't!" the man shouted, turning his aim toward Marcus. In that half-second of distraction, I lunged. I didn't strike for his weapon, I struck for the drive. I slammed my forearm into his wrist, forcing the gun upward as it discharged into the ceiling. The drive skittered across the floor, sliding toward the open vent. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I drove my shoulder into his chest, pinning him against the desk with the sheer, unrelenting force of a man who had nothing left to lose. The building's suppression system kicked in, a massive deluge of industrial-grade foam that instantly flooded the room, turning the floor into a slippery chemical trap. The man struggled, but the foam clogged his senses. I pinned his arm, twisted it until his weapon dropped, and then signaled Marcus. "Now!" Marcus scooped up the drive. "Dad, we have to go!" "Go!" I barked. "I'll hold him here!" I didn't wait for him to argue. I pushed the man down into the rising foam, forcing his face into the thick, suffocating lather. He struggled for a moment, then went limp. I knew it wasn't the end of his life, but it was the end of his power. By the time the actual authorities, not the corrupt local ones, but the internal security agents I had alerted with my final broadcast, crashed through the facility doors, the building was a tomb of foam and silence. They found me sitting in the lobby, my clothes torn, my body bruised, holding a cup of lukewarm water I'd found in the break room. Marcus was standing by the entrance, surrounded by agents, the encrypted drive held firmly in his hands. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look at me with pity or dismissal. He looked at me with pride. The fallout was absolute. The organized scheme was dismantled in a matter of weeks. The facility was shuttered, the arrests were international headlines, and my children, after a long, grueling debriefing, faced the consequences of their greed. They didn't get their inheritance. Instead, they got a long, hard lesson in the value of their own character. As for me, I didn't go back to a home. I moved to a small cabin in the mountains, a place where the only thing I have to worry about is the weather. People ask me sometimes if I regret the day my children put me in that place. I tell them no. They thought they were burying a man who had outlived his usefulness. They didn't realize that a colonel never truly retires. We just wait for the right operation to remind the world that some fires are better left unstirred. The burner phone is in a drawer, wiped clean. The uniform is in a box in the attic, and whenever I see a car idling too long on the road near my cabin, I don't get scared. I just smile, pour another cup of coffee, and wait, because I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what I'm capable of. I am the man they forgot to fear, and that was the greatest tactical advantage of all.